Henry VIII. The man collected wives the way some people collect parking tickets. Fast, messy, and with no intention of learning a lesson. 6 in total. A full punch card of royal disasters. And instead of paying the fine, he just executed half of them. He didn't just split from the Pope. He filed the world's messiest divorce papers, grabbed the family silver, and then torched the church on his way out. That's not reform. That's arson with paperwork. On the surface, Henry looked like a Renaissance dreamboat. Tall, athletic, basically the Tudor poster boy. But crack that glossy paint job, and underneath was a festering mess in a golden crown, more swamp monster than sex symbol. This wasn't a king. This was Britain's most dangerous mood swing. Morning hymns, evening beheadings, late-night roast swan. And if you survived dessert, congratulations, you lived another day. Now, before we descend into the Tudor nightmare of Henry's reign, hit that like button harder than he smashed the marriage market, subscribe for more royal carnage, and comment below, what's Henry's absolute worst deed? Bonus points if you can stomach naming his best. Because this isn't the story of 6 wives, this is the story of how England's golden boy decayed into the ultimate Tudor horror show. Henry VIII was born into a dynasty that had clawed its way out of a graveyard. Civil war had nearly eaten England alive, and suddenly, miracle baby. He grew into 6 feet of copperhead charisma, with a voice that rattled cathedral windows. Not just a prince, but Renaissance Superman in a custom doublet. It felt like England had gone from Game of Thrones to a Disney reboot overnight. The mud, the misery, banished. Instead, they got a prince so polished that chroniclers swore he even sweated perfume. Imagine showing up to football practice smelling of onions, and the other guy smells like cloves. Instant rage quit. Henry was restless energy in human form. He hunted until his dogs collapsed in steaming piles, wrestled courtiers like he was headlining WWE, Tudor edition, and fired arrows so sharp that ambassadors ducked mid-speech. Forget pampered royalty. Henry was the original Tudor Red Bull ad. Ambassadors went home raving that gravity itself moved out of his way. His stride, they claimed, could bend the earth. Sounds divine, until you remember that by middle age he could barely shuffle across a room without help. Gravity always wins. But he wasn't just muscle. He played music, sang, and composed like he was auditioning for Tudor Idol. Courtiers applauded politely, unaware those same graceful fingers would one day scrawl death warrants with just as much flair. The lute calluses faded. The bloodstains didn't. Then came the jousts. Henry didn't watch from the royal box. He suited up. The tilt yard became his demolition derby. Think NASCAR, but with horses, exploding lances, and exactly 0 safety rules. The crowd loved it. Who doesn't love a king who might impale himself for your entertainment? At court, he was a magnet. His laughter pulled people into orbit. His frown froze the room like a glacier. Men leaned when Henry leaned. Women swooned when Henry sneezed. Charisma wasn't his weapon. It was his nuke. On the streets, he was the people's prince. Crowds surged. Cobblestones shook. And England finally had its golden boy. Imagine if your leader wasn't just competent but hot. That was Henry. For once, people thought the nightmare might be over. Spoiler, it wasn't. But Henry didn't just want applause. He wanted conquest. Maps stamped with victory, banners in French mud, Spanish courtiers muttering his name like a curse. His ambition wasn't paranoid yet. It was just big, loud, and ruinously expensive. Basically, maxing out the Tudor treasury on jet skis. Even rivals admitted the boy was a problem. Fit, magnetic, dangerously brilliant. If fortune stuck with him, England might swagger like Rome reborn. He wore expectation like a cloak, dazzling, effortless. The sweat smelled of cloves, but the body always collects its debt. He began as daylight. The tragedy is watching the sun rot before it sets. Greenwich, January 1536. The tilt yard thundered with hooves and splintering lances. Henry, now mid-40s, heavier, slower, but still pretending to be the golden boy, hurled himself into the lists. Vanity said yes. His body said no. The horse stumbled. Henry pitched forward. 600 pounds of man plus armour slammed into the dirt. The impact was so brutal. Courtiers swore England itself cracked. He didn't move. For 2 hours the king lay motionless. Whispers rippled. Was the crown about to be lost too? Gravity? Not France, not Rome. Gravity. England's most feared warrior, KO'd by physics. But then he stirred. Relief turned sour. His leg was shredded, torn open in a wound that never healed. Swelling, bleeding, rotting. His body poisoned itself from within for the rest of his life. Achilles had a heel. Henry had a leg that doubled as a death sentence. And something else broke that day. His mind. Before the fall. Bold, radiant, reckless. After the fall. Paranoid, explosive, terrifying. To the Tudors, it was God's punishment. Today, we'd probably call it traumatic brain injury. Either way, the warranty on Henry's sanity was gone. Movement, the thing he prized most, was stolen. Hunts ended. Jousts vanished. The athlete of Europe slumped into chairs, his body thickening while his temper sharpened to a blade. Now court was a minefield. Laugh with him at lunch, lose your head by supper. Friends discarded like broken dice. Devotion meaningless against suspicion. The king who once filled rooms with music now emptied them with silence. Government twisted to match. Ministers axed overnight, accused of treason with no proof. Allies became traitors at a glance. Even queens, his supposed partners in Dynasty, found themselves one tantrum away from the scaffold. One day he rained gold coins like Tudor Oprah. The next he condemned servants for looking smug. God Save the King wasn't a cheer anymore. It was whispered like a survival spell. And here's the cruelest irony. Henry dreamed of being a new Caesar, a warrior king of destiny. Instead, he was undone by a stumble in the joust. Not swords, not empires, just one horse trip. Everything after, the wives, the wars, the executions, was noise to drown the truth. The Golden Prince was dead. What rose was a wounded tyrant, limping into history, dragging a nation with him. The prince who once stunned Europe with speed and elegance now looked like he was being eaten alive by his own throne. By the 1540s, Henry's waist ballooned past 54 inches, his body closing in on 400 pounds. Tailors weren't tailoring anymore, they were basically medieval carpenters, hammering cloth together like it was load-bearing architecture. Majesty didn't stride anymore. It sagged. His legs, once his proudest weapons, became anchors of misery. That jousting wound never healed. It just split wider, gushing, stinking, soaking through bandages faster than servants could burn them. Henry VIII didn't just have a limp, he was a walking court rumour with a pulse. And the unlucky ones were the grooms who had to clean him. They drew straws, like a game show where the prize was holding your nose in Tudor pus. Sources claim Henry flew into rages if attendants so much as winced. Imagine your boss yelling at you while you're trying not to vomit into the royal bandages. An honour, they called it. Sure, the honour of losing your lunch. Mobility turned into humiliation. Crutches tore his hands raw. Heavy chairs on wheels groaned under his weight as he was pushed from hall to hall. The same man who once shattered lances now wheezed through corridors like a parody of his former self. England's lion was reduced to being chauffeured across the palace like spoiled luggage. But here's the kicker. His appetite never slowed. Henry devoured banquets built for 30, course after course, as if eternal life could be swallowed whole. Picture watching your monarch collapse under his own body, while demanding more roast beef. Dinner with Henry was less feast and more live autopsy. Doctors swarmed him like flies. Poultices, cautery irons, endless leeches. They tried every cure short of an exorcism. They mixed up herbal brews with enough vinegar to strip paint. Nothing worked. The treatments weren't medicine, they were performance art, a way of pretending that the king, even while rotting, was still being saved. The palace air itself became treasonous. Musicians played with perfumed rags pressed discreetly to their noses. Ambassadors bowed in clouds of royal stench. To stand before Henry was to endure two kinds of power at once, the authority of the crown and the biological assault of a body in collapse. Splendor and corruption fused into one presence. Still, he demanded immortality by image. Holbein and others painted him as an immovable giant, legs wide, chest broad, fists on hips. These portraits are magnificent lies. Tudor Photoshop before Photoshop existed. England clung to the illusion because truth was unbearable. But courtiers couldn't escape truth. The smell was real. The temper was real. His suspicions and rages tightened the court like a noose. They once praised his vigor. Now they muttered behind sleeves about his paranoia, his bitterness, his bulk. The throne wasn't creaking under England's power. It was creaking under Henry. What began as one wound in a tilt yard had snowballed into catastrophe. The golden prince of Europe was gone. In his place stood a swollen tyrant, feared less for his strength than for the corruption dripping from every pore. Chroniclers barely had to exaggerate. His body alone was treason. And England was ruled by ruin on legs. The king, who once thundered into tournaments with a lance, now thundered into rooms with a portable toilet. Everywhere Henry went, servants trailed behind with a lacquered close stool, basically a gilded chamber pot on legs. Majesty had shrunk to a box for waste. Attendants had the worst job description in Europe. Nobles, grooms, even knights were forced to scrub, wipe, and haul what Henry left behind. Officially, it was still an honor. In reality, it was like winning the Tudor lottery and finding out the prize was diarrhea duty. His royal apartments turned swampy. The stench of his wounds mixed with the stench of waste until even visitors staggered. Imagine showing up to negotiate a treaty and gagging halfway through the king's greeting. Diplomacy, Tudor style. But appearances had to be staged. Hours of wrapping sores, layering linen, piling on fur and brocade until Henry's collapsing body resembled kingship again. He couldn't walk unaided. Courtiers smiled while supporting him, their faces saying, loyalty, their spines saying, lawsuit. The predator's stride was gone. What remained was a shuffle dressed in splendor. The irony was brutal. Renaissance thinkers saw monarchs as divine vessels, their bodies mirroring heaven itself. Henry's body? It mirrored a compost heap. Yet still courtiers bowed. Still ambassadors kissed his hand. Because admitting the truth that England's king was rotting alive was more dangerous than the rot itself. Behind the curtains, service was survival. Flinch at the smell? Risk execution. Hesitate with the stool? Risk execution. One wrong move and you weren't just fired, you were fired and beheaded. Some attendants prayed aloud while working, asking God for strength not to gag in the king's face. Serving Henry had become a holy war against your own gag reflex. And yet, his authority never faltered. Decrees still rolled out, wars still plotted, titles granted or stripped, all with the chamber pot parked politely nearby. Imagine a CEO holding board meetings while someone empties his bedpan. That was Tudor governance. Splendor and degradation fused into one monarchy. By this stage, Henry's throne didn't just wobble, it stank, and every subject in England inhaled that terror with him. She arrived in England like a royal earthquake. Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, niece of the Holy Roman Emperor, practically born with a crown embedded in her skull. First married to Prince Arthur, then to his brother Henry, she carried the prestige of dynasties and the hope of stability. England adored her. She was pious, steady, loyal, the kind of queen who could calm a country still twitching from civil war. But Henry measured love in one currency: male heirs. Catherine gave him stillbirths, miscarriages, and finally one surviving child, Mary, a daughter. To most fathers, a miracle. To Henry, a failure. He wanted a son. He got a girl. It was like ordering a war horse and receiving a sewing kit. At first, he played the doting husband. Crowned pageants, hand-holding in public, the Tudor version of Instagram couple goals. But the whispers started. Advisors muttered about curses, about her being Arthur's widow first. The Pope's dispensation, the license that made their marriage legal, was suddenly recast as evidence of sin. When Henry needed theology, he didn't pray. He weaponized it. Catherine didn't break. Summoned to court, she stood before bishops, lords, and half of Europe, swearing she came to Henry's bed a virgin and that their marriage was lawful before God. She didn't just defend herself, she invoked Spain, Rome, her dynasty. In that moment, one queen faced down two kingdoms, and she refused to flinch. But Henry's gaze had already drifted to Anne Boleyn, younger, sharper, dazzling with novelty. Catherine wasn't a queen anymore. She was an obstacle. And Henry's method of dealing with obstacles was simple. Smash them, preferably while claiming divine authority. Rome said no to annulment. Henry said no to Rome. And just like that, Catherine became the spark for the English Reformation. One woman's defiance set Henry against the Pope and ripped England out of Catholicism. Forget quiet annulments. This was divorce by sledgehammer. Catherine paid the price. Titles stripped, banished from court, even her daughter Mary taken from her. She spent her last years in damp castles, not as a queen, but as an exile with a fading pulse. For 20 years she had been England's heart. Now she was discarded like a broken pawn. When she died in 1536, suspicions swirled like smoke. Did Henry have her quietly poisoned? Or did sickness finally claim her? No one knew. But England whispered, because a king who couldn't show mercy in life wasn't expected to discover it in death. Her final letter cut sharper than any sword. She called herself Henry's loyal wife, prayed for his health, begged protection for their daughter. Grace, loyalty, dignity, virtues Henry no longer recognized. His response? He dressed in white. Mourning maybe, celebration maybe. Either way, it looked like theatre. Catherine's fate wrote the rulebook. The first wife recast as an obstacle. The first queen banished instead of cherished. The first to learn that Henry's marriage bed was a war zone, and queens were disposable soldiers. Loved by England, abandoned by her husband, Catherine's tragedy set the stage. Because waiting in the wings was Anne Boleyn, younger, hungrier, and destined for an ending far more spectacular than lonely exile. Anne Boleyn was everything Catherine wasn't: young, witty, and lethal to Henry's imagination. She didn't win him by fluttering eyelashes and quiet obedience. She won him by saying no. She withheld, teased, provoked, and turned the King of England into a panting teenager. Henry thought he was the hunter. Wrong. Anne set the trap, and England was about to pay for it. He wrote letters begging for her love, dripping with medieval thirst. He swore his soul couldn't rest unless it belonged to her. Meanwhile, she racked up jewels, estates, and promises of a crown. Anne didn't present herself as a fling. She presented herself as destiny, and it worked too well. Henry torched 1,000 years of Catholic tradition just to marry her. England went from Rome's favourite child to Rome's angriest dropout, all because one woman had the audacity to say, "Actually, I'm not free on Friday." But once crowned, Anne discovered seduction doesn't survive politics. Catherine still had loyalists whispering in corners. And worse, Anne delivered Elizabeth, not the longed-for son. Miscarriages followed. Henry's obsession soured into impatience, then paranoia. The sharp wit that once bewitched him now became a blade aimed at his pride. She teased his manhood, sparred with his ministers, and acted like she deserved power equal to the king himself. Henry, who had blown up Europe's biggest religion to have her, suddenly wanted out. And in Tudor England, out meant dead. Accusations rained down. Adultery, incest, treason. Ludicrous charges, but deadly ones. Servants, courtiers, even her own brother George Boleyn were dragged to the Tower. Tortured, condemned. To erase Anne, Henry scorched her entire circle. No survivors, no memories, no loose ends. Her trial was a sham. The verdict wasn't debated. It was pre-packed like a Tudor TV dinner. Guilty. Death. The only suspense was how spectacular the show would be. Her supposed lovers died first, paraded to the scaffold in a grim warm-up act. Anne watched as blood soaked the wood where she'd soon kneel. The message was clear. This is your preview, madam. Henry granted her mercy, not the axe, but a French swordsman. Quicker, cleaner, more dramatic. On the 19th of May, 1536, Anne mounted the scaffold in a simple gown, her black hair tucked under a linen cap. She prayed for the king's health with unnerving calm. And then, in a single stroke, her head fell. Silence swallowed the yard. Days later, Henry remarried. The woman he once risked eternity for was dumped in an unmarked grave inside the tower. Her portraits vanished, her name erased, her memory rewritten as a warning. But Anne's ghost refused to stay buried. Her daughter Elizabeth would one day take the throne, outshine Henry himself, and drag England into a golden age. Yet, in 1536, all that was still in the future. The blood was still fresh, and Henry's eye was already drifting to another, Jane Seymour, the woman who would give him both his dream and his deepest despair. Jane Seymour was Anne Boleyn's opposite in every way. Where Anne had been fiery, witty and dangerous, Jane seemed quiet, pale and pliant, like someone had swapped out a rapier for a butter knife. She lowered her eyes, spoke softly, and radiated innocence. To the court, she looked like peace in a white veil. To Henry, she looked like a human baby factory. But Jane wasn't naive. She'd served both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, watched one queen fight too openly, and the other push too boldly. Jane took notes. Her meekness was not ignorance. It was strategy. Silence became her disguise. Henry wasted no time. Anne's body was barely cold when he paraded Jane like England's new miracle. Courtiers gushed that she was the cure for all Henry's storms. Henry embraced the contrast. Where Anne argued, Jane agreed. Where Catherine defied, Jane deferred. Their marriage in May 1536 was greeted like aspirin for a national migraine. Jane smiled politely, stayed out of politics, and kept her head down, literally. The one time she dared to plead for mercy during the Pilgrimage of Grace, Henry's glare froze her to the marrow. His reply was chilling. Remember what happened to queens who pushed too far. Jane never tested him again. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was survival. Then, in October 1537, Jane delivered Henry's holy grail, a son. After 3 days of brutal labour, Edward was born. Bells rang, bonfires roared, and Henry declared Jane his true wife. 20 years of failed pregnancies and shattered marriages had finally produced what he wanted most. The Tudors had their heir. Henry had his vindication. But triumph curdled fast. 12 days later, Jane was dead, most likely from infection. The queen who gave England its future was buried before she could enjoy her crown. For once, Henry's grief was real. He wore black, locked himself away, refused audiences. The man who had discarded wives like costumes actually mourned this one. Jane was remembered not as the fiery queen or the tragic exile, but as the one who gave Henry what he wanted and vanished before he could turn on her. That was her secret to survival. She died too soon for his rage to catch her. Henry buried her at Windsor and decreed he would lie beside her for eternity. Historians note the irony. The only wife he ever truly loved was the one who never lived long enough to disappoint him. Jane's reign was short, but decisive. She proved that Henry's wives weren't judged by beauty, wit, or loyalty, only by utility. She succeeded because she produced a son. She was ideal because she died. And with her tomb sealed, Henry's appetite returned. The throne demanded another queen. And the next would discover that the deadliest sin wasn't defiance, it was simply failing to deliver. By 1539, Henry was a wreck. His body bloated, his leg wounds leaking through linen, his temper sharper than a guillotine. But the dynasty still dangled on the thread of one fragile boy, Edward. Jane Seymour had given him a son, but a sickly one. Marriage wasn't romance anymore. It was survival. Enter Thomas Cromwell, ever the strategist, pitching Anne of Cleves, sister to a German duke, Protestant ally, and supposedly a safe bet. To sweeten the deal, Holbein painted her portrait. Serene, fair, regal. Henry saw the picture and thought he'd scored another Jane Seymour. He said yes. Big mistake. When Anne arrived, Henry tried one of his old stunts, the gallant masquerade. He doused himself in musk, disguised his bulk, and burst in to surprise her. convinced he was still the heartthrob knight of Europe. Anne barely looked up. To her, this sweaty stranger wasn't a king in disguise. He was just a sweaty stranger, illusion, dead on arrival. Then came the reveal. Henry, already deflated, found her manners stiff, speech odd, features plain. He sneered in private, calling her a Flanders mare. That insult sprinted through the court faster than a hunting hound. For a king addicted to worship, Anne's indifference cut deeper than his leg wounds. Still, the wedding went ahead. Backing out would humiliate England, and Henry couldn't afford more weakness. On the 6th of January 1540, they married at Greenwich. Trumpets, pageantry, fireworks, and a groom sulking through the vows. That night, Henry declared the marriage unconsummated. His excuse? He was unmoved, which was funny because his mistresses reported no such problem. The issue wasn't Anne's body, it was Henry's pride. The fallout was brutal. Cromwell, who'd brokered the match, was scapegoated. Enemies pounced, charging him with treason and heresy. By July, his head was on a spike above London Bridge. Henry annulled the marriage the same month. Anne was forced to admit in public that it had never been consummated. Humiliation staged as diplomacy. But here's where Anne's story flips the Tudor script. She didn't resist, didn't rage, didn't cling to the crown. Instead, she yielded with grace, thanking Henry for sparing her life. In return, she walked away rich, estates, titles, and the honorary role of the king's sister. She stayed in England, respected and comfortable. Out of 6 wives, she was the only one who escaped whole. The cost fell on everyone else. Cromwell was butchered. Anne's reputation was mocked across Europe. And Henry? He became the punchline. Whispers of impotence spread like wildfire. The king who could dissolve a church but not consummate a marriage. But Henry wasn't finished. Even as Anne settled into her new life of cautious comfort, his gaze had already drifted to someone else. Catherine Howard, a teenager young enough to be his daughter. For England, that romance wouldn't end with annulment. It would end in blood. Catherine Howard was barely out of childhood when she was shoved onto England's deadliest stage. A teenager plucked from Anne of Cleves' household, she was the niece of the Duke of Norfolk and the latest pawn in the Tudor family chess match. To her kin, she was leverage. To herself, she was silk-wrapped bait. Henry adored her with manic intensity. His wounds, his stench, his collapsing body, all forgotten when Catherine danced into the room. He called her his rose without a thorn, showered her in jewels, and flaunted her on his arm like living proof that the king still had it. Courtiers cringed as the obese, rotting monarch paraded a girl young enough to be his daughter. To Henry, she wasn't a wife. She was a walking anti-aging cream. At first, Catherine smiled, curtsied, and played along. She danced, she laughed. She let herself be smothered by the king's obsessive affection. But her past was waiting. Whispers of youthful liaisons became daggers in enemy hands. Henry's passion twisted to paranoia, and paranoia got new legislation. Parliament invented a law just for her. Any queen who concealed a sexual past was guilty of treason. That wasn't law. That was Henry signing death warrants with Theology's ink. The dragnet closed fast. Friends, servants, and alleged lovers were arrested, tortured, executed. Her teenage missteps were inflated into state betrayal. Catherine herself barely understood the machinery grinding her to pieces. She wasn't a conspirator, she was a girl devoured by the system. Her arrest was chaos. Chroniclers describe her shrieking through Hampton Court, begging Henry to see her, pleading for mercy. Guards dragged her away as her screams echoed through the palace. The rose without a thorn was now branded poison, and Henry, once besotted, turned stone cold. On the 13th of February 1542, Catherine Howard walked trembling to the scaffold on Tower Green. Pale but composed, she admitted her faults, prayed for mercy, and knelt. The axe fell in one clean stroke. A teenager's head toppled into history to preserve the pride of a king already decomposing from the inside out. Her death wasn't justice, it was farce. A ritual slaughter, staged for the satisfaction of a monarch desperate to prove he still had control. Over his court, over his women, over the narrative of his decline. And when her blood sank into Tower stones, Henry barely paused. Another woman already waited in the wings, Catherine Parr. But unlike Catherine Howard, she wouldn't survive by innocence or youth. She'd survive by playing the king's game better than he did. By 1543, Henry VIII wasn't a king, he was a collapsing empire stuffed into a suit of cloth and fur. Obese, stinking, his legs bursting with sores, his moods lashing out like thunder. Few women would have seen him as anything but nightmare. Catherine Parr, twice widowed and without power, had no choice. When the king picked you, refusal wasn't on the menu. She wasn't chosen for beauty or youth, she was chosen for stability. Catherine was smart, diplomatic, and skilled at playing whatever role Henry demanded. She treated his children kindly, weaving Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward into something like a family. For once, the Tudor court looked touched by warmth. Illusion? Yes. But in a kingdom ruled by terror, illusion mattered. But Catherine carried something Henry's other wives hadn't: conviction. A devout Protestant, she read banned books, surrounded herself with reformist thinkers, and even published theological works under her own name. The first English queen ever to go to press. It was bold. Too bold. By 1546, her enemies pounced. Conservative factions accused her of heresy, of daring to challenge Henry in matters of faith. A warrant for her arrest was drawn. For most queens, that was the prelude to Tower Green. But Catherine wasn't most queens. When she heard of it, she didn't panic. She pivoted. Kneeling before Henry, she played the part of the submissive wife, insisting she had never meant to lecture him, only to ease his suffering with gentle talk. Not a rival, not a teacher, just a comfort. Submission as camouflage. It worked. Henry, flattered and soothed, pulled back. When guards came the next day to seize her, Henry dismissed them with contempt, declaring his queen innocent. Catherine had done what no wife before her had. She had beaten the executioner by outsmarting the tyrant. For the rest of his reign, she walked a razor's edge, acting as regent in his absence, managing his children, enduring his decaying presence. While the others had died, she endured. Catherine Parr's legacy was survival, not by beauty, not by youth, not by obedience, but by calculation. She was the queen who learned that Henry could be flattered into dropping his sword. And with her, the grisly parade of 6 wives reached its end. Catherine of Aragon's exile, Anne Boleyn's sword, Jane Seymour's sacrifice, Anne of Cleves's retreat, Catherine Howard's axe, Catherine Parr's survival. 6 women, 6 endings, 1 king devouring them all. By the time Henry died, his body was collapsing, his kingdom weakened, his legacy rotting beneath the weight of his appetites. The Golden Prince had become a swollen tyrant. His silence in death was louder than any hymn. England's brightest hope had decayed into its darkest king. The body that once dazzled Europe now demanded constant feeding, and Henry obeyed like it was holy law. Chroniclers described meals so massive they could fuel an army on campaign. But Henry's own campaign rarely stretched beyond the shuffle from chair to bed. The feasts were grotesque spectacle, whole swans roasted to a golden shine, boars lacquered in sugar like edible furniture, peacocks stitched back into their feathers so they looked alive again, then served dead on the platter, venison by the heap, pies the size of barrels, oceans of wine pouring across silver. One ambassador wrote that the very air grew greasy, as if the palace itself had been basted. These weren't dinners, they were stage plays. Every course a spell, every bite a declaration. The king eats, therefore the realm endures. Servants moved like stagehands in a grotesque performance. Tasting men risked their lives with every bite, human shields against poison. Guards ringed the table as if defending a fortress made of pork. Musicians timed their playing to disguise the rhythm of chewing. Even banquets became military exercises in loyalty. And no one dared name the contradiction. Outside those gilded halls, England strained under debt and hunger. But to say aloud that the king ate like a titan while his people starved? Treason. So courtiers rehearsed the lie. If Henry could gorge like a god, then England must still be strong. The lie dripped in grease but bound the realm tighter than law. Banquets sprawled into carnivals. Dancers leapt between courses. Torches shimmered on gilt plates. Henry sometimes dozed mid-feast, then woke to demand more. Laughter on command, applause when summoned, prayer when his temper shifted. Dining with Henry was less dinner, more hostage theatre. When the torches guttered out, the illusion collapsed. Bones heaped into mounds, sauces hardened into slick crusts, bread mashed into the floorboards. Rats darted into the wreckage, gnawing on the remains of royal excess. Chronicler Edward Hall wrote it best: gluttony in its most royal vesture, yet vile to behold when the music ceased. Even his body mirrored the table. The weaker he became, the more desperately he ate, as though eternity could be chewed one mouthful at a time. Feasts became camouflage, a dazzling veil over a body that was rotting from the inside out. The banquet table was his second throne, a stage where Henry pretended vigor, dominion, eternity. But behind the glittering plates lay the truth. The kingdom starved, the king swelled, and the gulf between the two could only be filled with meat and fear. If the banquet table was Henry's stage of indulgence, the palace corridors were his maze of menace. As his body collapsed, suspicion swelled. He slept beside stacked weapons, jolting awake in panic, guards pacing like anxious ghosts outside his chamber. He gorged himself on swan and wine, but starved for peace. His belly was full. His mind was hollow. Even the palaces warped under his paranoia. Once monuments to majesty, they became fortresses of distrust. Not to keep enemies out, but to lock everyone else in. Spies multiplied like rats. Informants skulked in taverns, chapels, even servant dormitories, hunting for scraps of rumor to sell. A sigh might be treason. A careless joke could be replayed as conspiracy. Later Protestant chroniclers claimed England breathed suspicion and exhaled confession under torment. Even Catholic sources admitted no gesture was safe. Living near Henry was like living inside a never-ending interrogation. The charges became absurd. Men condemned for dreams, women accused for glances. Nobles toppled under accusations so vague even judges stammered through the verdicts. One bitter observer wrote, "England had become a land where silence itself may speak against you." And fear didn't stop at the palace gates. The entire realm inhaled dread with its daily bread. Even Henry's children weren't spared. Mary and Elizabeth were yanked in and out of legitimacy like toys. One day heirs, the next bastards. Edward, the fragile prize, was watched more like evidence than guarded like a son. His nursery became just another arena of surveillance. The cradle itself was chained to the scaffold. At night the kingdom pulsed with panic. Guards patrolled with torches, interrogations unfolded in candlelit chambers, and confessions spilled not from truth but from terror. Chronicler Raphael Holinshed summed it up. Silence was the safest speech, and every corner seemed to hide a spy. And in a bitter twist, fear did what Henry's charm once had. Nobles who might have risen in rebellion stayed frozen in obedience, paralyzed not by loyalty, but by dread. Terror held the kingdom together, where devotion had failed. But paranoia has no cure. No spy could drain his sores. No execution could erase infection. No confession could calm his storms. Henry had reshaped England into a body of fear, and like his own body, it was already putrefying from within. By the late 1540s, Henry's government no longer ran on law or diplomacy. It ran on executions. England's calendar was measured not in months but in scaffoldings. His favourites learned the trap. Thomas More praised him as a Renaissance prince, ended up branded traitor. Thomas Cromwell engineered his reforms, ended up branded heretic and traitor, just to be thorough. The men who built his power found themselves dangling from it. Trials were theatre, charges pre-written, verdicts rehearsed. Chronicler Edward Hall said it best. The law did not speak, but repeated the voice of the king. Translation: Henry had turned justice into karaoke. Religion? A loaded weapon. Catholics burned one year, Protestants the next. No creed was safe. Reformers, traditionalists, all fed the flames. A sermon could damn you, but silence could damn you too. Faith wasn't salvation. It was a snare with no exits. And the executions weren't private affairs. Crowds were dragged to watch, gasping, fainting, praying. No one dared leave early. To slip away before the axe fell looked like sympathy, and sympathy was treason. The scaffold was his dining table, and England was the unwilling banquet. Henry insisted it was righteousness. Justice must walk before mercy, else mercy is but weakness. But even his allies muttered. Justice had become indistinguishable from whim. The axe was no longer punishment, it was punctuation, the full stop on every disagreement. Abroad, the disgust was palpable. Ambassadors called him engorged, tyrannical, more feared than respected. One envoy sneered that Henry feeds upon his people as upon meat. Across Europe, the irony spread. A king desperate for eternal honor was remembered instead as a butcher of his own subjects. At home, whispers crept like mildew. Taverns muttered of omens. Parishes murmured of deliverance. Some quietly hoped death itself would do what rebellion could not. By 1546, even courtiers admitted in secret, men spoke softly of nature, accomplishing what no subject dared. Translation: everyone was just waiting for the guy to die. Meanwhile, Henry withdrew into shadows. He suspected doctors of poisoning him, dismissed cooks over trifles, and eyed servants as conspirators. The man who once ruled with overwhelming presence now ruled with corrosive absence, muttering, mistrustful, festering in his chambers. England had reached the last act, a kingdom bound by fear, governed by a king who devoured trust as eagerly as meat. All that remained was silence, and the slow waiting for his monstrous body to collapse under its own weight. Henry VIII no longer strode like a king. He sagged like a ruin. Attendants whispered that he was more corpse than sovereign, dragged around in a padded chair on wheels. The majesty of hunts, jousts, and dances was gone. What remained was a daily ritual of decay, endured by a court too terrified to look away. His legs were shredded beyond repair, splitting open under his weight, soaking the floors with pus. Doctors squabbled over herbs and poultices, while servants stuffed scented rags against their faces just to survive the stench. His arrival no longer came with trumpets. It came with odor. Mobility turned into mechanics. Chairs cranked him upright with the creak of gears. Pulleys lowered him into bed with the groan of rope. Reinforced stools followed him from chamber to chamber, like grotesque regalia. Once, England's lion charged on horseback. Now, he was hoisted like burden through his own palaces. Even his banquets betrayed him. Feasts that once screamed abundance curdled into poison. His belly swelled, his skin folded, his face puffed into a swollen mask. Each bite was less nourishment than self-destruction. He wasn't feeding himself, he was devouring himself. Around this wreckage, silence became etiquette. No one dared mention the smell or the stains seeping under his chair. A single grimace could cost a man his head. So courtiers bowed, applauded, and smiled, as if nothing rotted in the room. Court life became pantomime. Clap for the music, ignore the corpse. At night, the mask slipped. Attendants heard him roar in pain, the scrape of wheels and pulleys echoing through the halls. Guards swore he cried out names, wives, ministers, the dead, summoned as ghosts to torment him. Whether it was pain or guilt, no one dared ask. Mistrust consumed him. Doctors were accused of plotting poison. Servants dismissed over trifles. Priests eyed with suspicion, as though last rites were assassination attempts. Majesty had decayed into paranoia. The closest attendants suffered most. Pages gagged while wrapping his wounds. Courtiers drew straws for stool duty. To serve Henry in these years wasn't honor. It was trench warfare against rot, dressed up in velvet. Abroad, ambassadors tried diplomacy with disgust. They called him much altered or seemingly immobile. Polite code for England was ruled by a collapsing monument, yet his signature still executed, his glare still destroyed. A dying king with unchecked power was more dangerous than any warrior. His throne was already a coffin, and England held its breath at its edge. The end didn't come clean. It crawled toward Henry inch by inch, like mold creeping across stone. The giant who once dazzled Europe now sagged on cushions, wheezing against his own bulk. His eyelids drooped over bloodshot eyes, his cheeks sagged into folds that erased his face, and every breath rasped like a bellows with torn leather. Breathing itself seemed mutiny. The chamber stayed dim, curtains drawn, not just to soften daylight but to hide him from it. Physicians swarmed with their rituals, bleeding, leeches, poultices, herbs, until the air thickened like swamp stew. None of it worked. Their job wasn't to cure him. Their job was to pretend hope still lived in the room. He even resisted priests. The irony was savage. The man who had crowned himself supreme head of the church shrank from sacraments like they were assassins. Blessings, he muttered, would only hasten death. Only when pain crushed suspicion did he relent, letting prayers drift over a body more wound than flesh. Even God had to wait until Henry surrendered. Those who entered carried nightmares back with them. They told of sheets glued to lesions, tearing flesh when he turned, of blackened sores bubbling like open cauldrons, of a stench so thick it stitched itself into their clothes and hair, haunting them long after they left. Serving Henry in life had been dangerous. Serving him in death was contamination. And yet, he terrified still. A rasped order from his ruined throat could strip a man of land or life. Musicians played through perfumed cloths, courtiers bowed with watering eyes. When he demanded silence, the chamber froze, broken only by his ragged breathing. The lion had shriveled, but even the twitch of a dying lion could kill. Names spilled out of him like curses. Catherine, Anne, Jane, wives muttered without fondness, ministers long dead, rivals buried decades earlier. The past rose up to gnaw him while he rotted in real time. Meanwhile, the court circled like vultures. Every cough, every groan was passed as an omen. Factions rehearsed victories before the body had even quit. The deathbed was not sanctuary, it was stagecraft. Men auditioned for power in the shadows of his collapse. But death toyed with him. It dangled him between stupor and gasping, dragging out the horror. His reign of fear didn't end when the body failed. It grew stronger, suffocating everyone forced to linger in the chamber. At last the struggle peaked. His chest rattled, eyes rolled upward, hands jerked like broken marionettes. Fragments spilled from his lips. Some heard prayers, others swore they heard curses. No one agreed on the words, but all agreed on the sight. England's most infamous king reduced to choking gurgles, lungs drowning under their own weight. And still, Henry wasn't finished. Death wasn't the finale. His body had one more act to play, a final outrage that turned even burial into a nightmare. They stuffed Henry into his coffin the way butchers pack meat into barrels. Even dead, his body mocked control, swelling against the wood as if daring his servants to contain him. The lid was hammered down not with reverence, but with desperation. The cortege set out for Windsor in winter silence. Horses strained against the swollen casket, their breath frosting in the air. Courtiers rode stiff as statues, terrified that a stray word might stir the corpse they followed. Some swore the animals tossed their heads in protest, as if recoiling from what they dragged behind them. At Sion Abbey, where the coffin rested overnight, came the outrage. The pressure inside grew until wood surrendered with a crack like gunfire. The coffin split, leaking across the stone floor. Chroniclers whispered of stray dogs nosing at the runoff before being beaten back, a grotesque parody of loyalty. In life, Henry had consumed his people. In death, he fed beasts. Even at Windsor, burial went wrong. As the coffin was lowered, the earth gave way, pallbearers stumbling as though the grave itself resisted. To some, it was divine judgment, the soil refusing the king who had shattered altar and law. To others, it was fitting symmetry. A reign that had ended in chaos could not rest in order. The funeral itself sagged under ritual. Priests muttered prayers quickly, as if eager to escape. Courtiers bowed stiffly, avoiding the box, pretending not to know what had already burst inside it. The king who once demanded reverence now lay in a leaking coffin, his majesty dissolving faster than incense smoke. Outside the chapel, the stories spread. Villagers whispered of foul air drifting from Windsor. Some swore they saw a swollen figure pacing the grounds at night, others that dogs howled to phantom feasts at Sion. Myths grew, but the truth was ghastly enough. Henry had dreamed of eternity. painted by Holbein as a giant, remembered as England's invincible monarch. Instead, his final monument was a coffin that burst open, dogs lapping at what spilled, and whispers too dark for marble to contain. He left England not glory but residue, a monarch who had devoured his wives, his kingdom, and himself, and who, in death, delivered one last humiliation. Majesty ruptured, reverence curdled. And when kings leave behind only filth and silence, the realm inherits not power but ruin. History likes its kings polished. Oil portraits, gleaming robes, eyes locked on eternity. Henry endures that way. Holbein's giant, fists on hips, the very picture of majesty. But peel back the paint and the truth seeps out. A body swollen to bursting, courtiers gagging in silence, and a coffin that cracked like rotten timber. We remember him for 6 wives, their names recited like a nursery rhyme. Yet his real marriage was to ruin itself, sealed in blood, fear, and infection. His loudest legacy was the break with Rome, the church he ripped into his own image. But inside the palaces, his quieter legacy was suffocation. Servants trembling at the stool, courtiers rehearsing smiles while the king's chamber poisoned the air. England was ruled not just by law, but by the fumes of its sovereign. Majesty slid into absurdity. A man who shattered kingdoms could no longer cross a room. A king who demanded eternal reverence ended up a swollen figure hauled by ropes. And when his coffin split at Sion Abbey, the rumours ran faster than any royal proclamation. Dogs lapping at the seepage, a monarch reduced to animal feed. That image, not the portraits, not the sermons, became the truest record of his reign. So remember Henry not only as the tyrant with 6 wives, nor merely the king who built a church in his own reflection, but as the sovereign whose body split its own coffin. Because when kingship itself collapses, what lingers is not majesty preserved, but the silence, the ruin, and the rot left in its wake. Two sisters, one crown, Mary and Elizabeth Tudor, heirs, rivals, survivors. One branded Bloody Mary, the other Gloriana, a Catholic hammer and a Protestant phoenix, forged in the same royal chaos. Their father, Henry VIII, left them a kingdom soaked in paranoia and paperwork. He also left them a masterclass in humiliation, disinherited, re-legitimized, tossed around like dice at a tavern. But against every odd, both wore the crown. This is not a fairy tale of Tudor sisterhood, it's a demolition derby of faith, politics, and survival, starring the daughters of England's most dangerous dad. Mary Tudor entered the world in 1516, a long-awaited child in a marriage already cracking under the pressure of miscarriages and stillbirths. Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon celebrated her arrival because she proved fertility wasn't a myth in the Tudor household, but Mary carried the wrong chromosomes. To Henry, she wasn't proof of stability, she was a problem wrapped in lace. A princess wasn't an heir, she was a diplomatic coupon. Her education, however, was fit for a ruler. Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Isabella of Castile, raised her with Spanish steel, Latin, French, music, theology, even politics. By adolescence, Mary could spar with ambassadors and priests alike, convinced she had inherited her father's intellect and her mother's conviction. The bitter irony was clear. Mary was trained like a monarch in a world that told her she was only valuable as a bride. Henry wasted no time playing the marriage lottery. Before she could walk, Mary was pledged to princes across Europe like a pawn in an endless diplomatic chess game. At 2 years old, she was promised to the French Dauphin. At 6, she was redirected to her Habsburg cousin Charles. If Tinder had existed, Mary's profile would have been swiped right by half the crowned heads of Europe, only for Henry to ghost them all whenever politics shifted. Her identity was equally steeped in faith. Catherine raised her daughter in the full glow of Catholic ritual, daily mass, confession, prayers laced with incense. Mary inhaled religion as lifeblood, anchoring herself in the belief that she was destined for more than a dynastic marriage. But at court, this devotion began to look outdated, even suspicious. Humanist tutors whispered new ideas, courtiers toyed with Protestantism, and Mary's piety seemed increasingly like a badge of defiance. Then came Elizabeth. Born in 1533, she was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman Henry detonated his marriage, his church, and half of Europe's patience to possess. Elizabeth arrived not with universal joy, but with political whiplash. Henry had broken with Rome to crown her legitimacy, only to be disappointed by another daughter. She was named after Henry's mother and paraded as proof Anne could produce heirs. But to Mary, Elizabeth's birth was a demotion stamped in blood-red ink. Mary's world collapsed overnight. She was stripped of her title, barred from her mother, and forced to serve the baby sister who had replaced her. What had once been her inheritance became her downfall. Court life turned into theatre, courtiers bowing to Elizabeth as heir, while sneering at Mary as nothing. For a teenager, already frail and melancholic, this was psychological warfare ordered by her own father. Elizabeth's early years were no fairy tale either. When Anne Boleyn was executed in 1536, Elizabeth, barely 2 years old, was declared illegitimate. Overnight, she went from high and mighty princess to political orphan. She grew up, knowing her fate depended not on her father's affection, but on her ability to stay useful, invisible, or charming enough to be tolerated. It was a brutal training ground in self-preservation. Yet Elizabeth thrived where others would have withered. Her education was world-class: Latin, French, Italian, and eventually Greek, alongside rhetoric, philosophy, and theology. She wasn't just learning languages, she was learning how to spin words into weapons. By adolescence, she could translate classics, compose speeches, and disarm foreign envoys with wit. If Mary embodied Spain's solemn piety, Elizabeth embodied England's sharp new humanism. The Tudor court never let them forget their precarious status. Gossip swirled in corridors, factions bet on which sister might rise, and legitimacy was less a birthright than a game of musical chairs dictated by Henry's moods. Both girls learned the same cruel lesson. Survival meant watching, waiting, and weaponizing every ounce of wit or devotion. Mary leaned into ritual, convinced that belief was her fortress. Elizabeth sharpened her tongue, knowing words could shield her better than titles. Neither had a guaranteed future, only a dangerous apprenticeship in the art of staying alive. By the time Henry VIII thundered into old age, his daughters weren't just royal afterthoughts. They were forged into rivals, allies, and contenders in training, each preparing, whether they admitted it or not, for the day England might turn to them. In Tudor politics, daughters were rarely just daughters. They were bargaining chips wrapped in silk. Mary's birth placed her at the center of Europe's marriage market, where alliances were inked not in treaties but in betrothals. From the cradle, her name appeared in negotiations stretching from Paris to Madrid. At 2 years old, she was promised to the French Dauphin, an engagement meant to soothe centuries of Anglo-French rivalry. By 6, the plan shifted. She was redirected toward her Habsburg cousin Charles, the future Holy Roman Emperor. To courtiers, these weren't nursery games. They were serious gambits in the chessboard of dynasties. Each proposal reflected England's precarious standing. Peace with France, marry Mary to the Dauphin, alliance with Spain, offer her to Charles. When politics soured, contracts were torn up and rewritten. She became a child not of constancy, but of contingency. Her fate rewritten every time Henry changed foreign policy. Foreign ambassadors saw the risks clearly. If Mary married a French prince, England could be reduced to a junior partner across the Channel. If she wed Charles, England might disappear into the vast Habsburg Empire. To friends, she was the bridge to power. To enemies, she was the crack in England's defences. This wasn't abstract. Courtiers at home debated what would happen if Mary married abroad and then inherited the crown. Would England's independence survive, or would the kingdom itself be swallowed into another empire? Even as a child, Mary embodied a question that haunted her father's reign. Was the Tudor dynasty strong enough to stand alone? Meanwhile, Mary herself grew into the role with unexpected gravity. Fluent in Latin and French, she could charm ambassadors at banquets, carrying herself with the dignity of a queen in waiting. Reports back to Madrid and Vienna described her as imperial in bearing, a young woman whose polish only heightened her value as a diplomatic prize. But Henry VIII did not see his daughter's brilliance as her own. To him, she was leverage, a human treaty who could be shuffled and regifted whenever it suited him. The fact that she had no brother only magnified the pressure. Every year that passed without a male heir made Mary's future more dangerous, because she was no longer just a bride, she was potentially England itself. And with that potential came peril. A foreign husband could become England's ruler in practice, dragging the kingdom into wars and policies that had nothing to do with its own interests. The courtiers who once toasted her betrothals began to whisper that Mary was not simply an asset, she was a liability that might one day destroy the independence her father claimed to protect. For Mary, this meant adolescence spent not on romance or adventure, but on waiting. Waiting to learn which crown would claim her hand, which empire would absorb her fate, and whether her father's shifting loyalties would leave her stranded. Unlike her brothers who never lived long enough to matter, she endured, and her endurance made her both indispensable and dangerous. What no one could yet imagine was that this daughter, so long reduced to a treaty on legs, would one day seize power herself. The pawn on Europe's board would not remain a pawn forever. Henry VIII's quest for a son didn't just wreck his marriage, it detonated Europe's balance of power. Catherine of Aragon wasn't any wife. She was the aunt of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. When Henry sought annulment, it became more than a domestic scandal. Rome stalled, Charles fumed, and England's dynastic crisis became a continental chess match. In 1533, Henry crowned Anne Boleyn as queen and declared Elizabeth his new heir. It was a pageant for some and a nightmare for others. Catherine was exiled, her status stripped. Ambassadors wrote home of a kingdom tearing itself apart. Ordinary people muttered in taverns, still loyal to Catherine, while reformist courtiers celebrated Anne as the dawn of a new England. The shock was not just symbolic, it was legal. Henry forced Parliament to pass the Act of Supremacy, making him head of the Church of England. Refusing the oath meant treason. Overnight, centuries of loyalty to Rome became a capital crime. Priests who hesitated were hanged, scholars fled abroad, and those who stayed learned to measure their words with care. For Mary, the new laws were a noose. A lifetime of Catholic ritual now branded her defiance. She refused to renounce the Pope, quietly maintaining Mass in her household. Every priest she kept, every whispered prayer, became an act of resistance. Her defiance was noted, whispered about, and catalogued in ambassadorial dispatches. Mary was no longer just a disobedient daughter. She was a political risk. The danger bled into her health. Reports from the time describe her fainting fits, irregular cycles, and a deep melancholy that worsened as she was isolated from her mother. Some later historians suspect the trauma scarred her body permanently, contributing to her later struggles with fertility. Whatever the cause, Mary's body became another battlefield in her father's war against Catherine. Meanwhile, Anne Boleyn embodied everything Mary had lost. Anne's faction at court mocked the old queen and her daughter, parading Elizabeth as the true future. But Anne's brilliance was fragile. She was expected to deliver a son to secure Henry's gamble. When Elizabeth arrived instead, the irony was brutal. Henry had torn down church and crown only to crown another daughter. Foreign courts watched with fascination and disgust. The French saw opportunity in England's fracture, while the Habsburgs seethed. To Charles V, Mary was still his cousin, a living reminder that Henry's new marriage was illegitimate in Catholic eyes. Diplomats whispered that if Henry pushed too far, Spain might back Mary as the rightful heir. The Reformation had cracked England open, and Mary was the splinter no one could remove. Mary herself faced constant interrogation. Would she call herself illegitimate? Would she accept Anne as queen? Would she sign documents that branded her mother's marriage unlawful? Each refusal risked prison, even death. Each concession cut deeper into her pride. She learned to walk the line with precision, outwardly obedient, inwardly unyielding. When Catherine died in 1536, Mary's last anchor was gone. Henry refused her even the dignity of attending the funeral. To Europe, it was confirmation that Catherine's line was finished. But Mary carried the memory like armor, insisting she was her mother's daughter, the true heir in a kingdom that had cast her aside. By the end of the 1530s, Mary had endured exile, interrogation, illness, and loss, yet still refused to yield her faith. She was no longer the girl groomed for dynastic marriage. She was a woman hardened in opposition, enduring inside a system designed to erase her. What Henry saw as humiliation, Mary was turning into defiance. In 1537, Jane Seymour delivered what no queen before her had managed, a living son. Edward's birth was celebrated with cannons, bonfires, and church bells, a wave of relief that Henry finally had the heir he craved. For Mary and Elizabeth, it was a turning point. They were no longer central to dynastic hopes. They were sidelined half-sisters in a kingdom that believed it had no further use for them. Edward's arrival rewrote the script of succession. Mary was tolerated, but only as a reminder of Catherine of Aragon's failed marriage. Elizabeth was even further down the ladder, branded a bastard and overshadowed by the boy whose fragile existence redefined their futures. In a single moment, both sisters went from bargaining chips in Europe's marriage market to ornaments in a court that no longer needed them. Foreign courts took note. Ambassadors who once pursued Mary's hand with urgency now dismissed her prospects, and Elizabeth was rarely mentioned at all. Edward's cradle became the foundation of England's diplomacy. Treaties, alliances, and hopes for stability all rested on the health of a single boy. For Mary and Elizabeth, it was the first taste of irrelevance in a dynasty that thrived on constant shifts. Yet irrelevance had its own lessons. Mary, in her 20s, leaned more firmly into Catholic ritual. Isolated but not defeated, she framed her stubbornness as conviction. Every mass attended, every refusal to acknowledge reform, became an act of identity in a court that pressed her to change. She was not a leader yet, but she was beginning to act like one. Elizabeth found her path in learning. Placed under the care of Catherine Parr, Henry's last queen, she absorbed languages, rhetoric, and philosophy with an intensity that impressed every tutor. More than that, she studied Catherine's balancing act, a devout Protestant who still navigated Henry's unpredictable moods with tact. Elizabeth was too young to command, but she was already rehearsing power as performance. When Henry died in 1547, the crown passed to a boy of 9. Edward VI was king in name, but real power lay with his Regency Council, dominated by Protestant nobles. Reforms swept England faster and harder than ever before. Altars were stripped, Latin banished from services, and resistance punished. For Mary, this was no longer theological disagreement, it was war on her very soul. The council's pressure was relentless. Mary was ordered to abandon Catholic Mass and conform to the new church. She refused. Her defiance was not only personal but political, supported by whispers of aid from her Habsburg relatives abroad. For the council, this was sedition. For Mary, it was the last tether to her mother's honor and her God. The family rift became public in 1549, when Edward, now 12, confronted Mary in tears, begging her to yield her religion. She refused him coldly, reminding her brother that her conscience was not his to command. The moment crystallized their differences. A boy king demanding obedience, a grown woman defying him openly. England held its breath, watching as royal siblings clashed over the soul of the nation. Elizabeth charted a different course. She neither defied nor surrendered. She conformed when necessary, spoke cautiously when asked, and built a reputation for prudence. Her restraint made her a safer figure in the eyes of those shaping Edward's reign. Where Mary's defiance drew fire, Elizabeth's quiet adaptability gave her space to grow unnoticed, a long game of resilience that would later define her reign. Edward's short reign revealed two paths of power. Mary was the immovable fortress of Catholic tradition, openly resisting even when it placed her life at risk. Elizabeth was the shadow, moving carefully, waiting for time to tilt the board. Both were rehearsing for crowns they did not yet wear, in a kingdom that had not yet realized how much it would depend on them. Edward VI's health began failing in 1553, and with it, the Tudor dynasty's fragile stability unraveled. He was a boy in his teens, coughing himself toward an early grave, while his Regency Council scrambled to control what would come next. Neither Mary nor Elizabeth fit the vision of a Protestant future. One was a staunch Catholic, the other too young and politically uncertain. The council needed a solution that would keep power in their own hands. That solution was Lady Jane Grey, barely 16, scholarly, devoutly Protestant, and recently married to Guildford Dudley, the son of the Duke of Northumberland. She was the perfect puppet for ambitious men. Edward himself signed a document naming Jane his heir, cutting out both of his half-sisters. It was a desperate gamble. Replace 2 Tudor daughters with a pliant cousin. On the 10th of July 1553, Jane was proclaimed Queen. Trumpets blared, heralds shouted her name, but the reaction was tepid at best. London did not cheer. Instead, people muttered treason in markets and taverns. For all her Protestant credentials, Jane had no legitimacy in the eyes of the people. To most, she was a pawn of Northumberland, not a queen chosen by God or blood. Mary, however, did not wait for events to settle. From her estates in East Anglia, she rallied nobles, retainers, and commoners to her banner. Letters spread her claim across the countryside, invoking loyalty to Henry's true daughter and the Catholic faith still alive in much of England. Within days, she commanded an army larger than anything Northumberland could muster. Her march on London became a show of strength that no proclamation could match. Elizabeth watched cautiously. At first, she hesitated, weighing her options. To throw her support behind Jane was to side with Northumberland's regime, already tottering. To back Mary was to risk being bound to Catholic reaction. She waited, letting the balance of power reveal itself, then leaned toward Mary once it was clear her sister's forces had momentum. Elizabeth's careful timing spared her from being tied to the losing side. Jane herself was reluctant from the beginning. Contemporary reports describe her weeping at her proclamation, recognizing she was being forced into a role she neither sought nor desired. The crown, placed on her head by others, sat uneasily. She was queen in name, prisoner in fact, surrounded by men who intended to wield her authority for their own designs. Within 9 days, the experiment collapsed. Mary's army entered London without serious resistance, cheered by crowds who saw her not as a usurper but as Henry VIII's true heir. Jane's reign dissolved almost before it began. Her proclamations were torn down, her name cursed, her throne gone. She was taken to the Tower of London, the same fortress that symbolized royal triumph and royal ruin alike. Northumberland, architect of the scheme, was arrested and executed. Jane, still a teenager, was spared for the moment, her youth and obvious manipulation by others buying her a fragile reprieve. The so-called 9-day queen remained alive but imprisoned, a warning of how quickly political gambits could collapse. Mary's victory was more than personal vindication. It was the first time in English history that a woman had seized the crown by right of birth and by force of arms. She entered London not as a bride or regent, but as a queen in her own name, welcomed by her people. The rules of succession had been rewritten not by Edward's pen, but by Mary's determination. Elizabeth rode beside her during the triumphal entry, outwardly united in sisterly loyalty. Beneath the smiles, however, both knew the truth. Mary's triumph was Elizabeth's lesson. Power in Tudor England was not granted. It had to be claimed, defended, and performed. For one sister, the lesson had just begun. For the other, it had already been learned. Mary's entry into London in 1553 was not a conquest of soldiers, but of voices. Crowds cheered, bells rang, and for the first time in English history, a woman was crowned in her own right. Dressed in purple velvet, she processed through the city streets as if fate itself had restored her. The people who had once mocked her as illegitimate now hailed her as Henry VIII's true heir. To Mary, this was not just victory, but providence. Humiliation, exile, and defiance had all prepared her for this moment. She believed God had preserved her for a singular mission, to restore England to the Catholic order. Every act of government, proclamations, treaties, marriages, would be judged against that divine task. To her, compromise was not politics, it was betrayal. Her first priority was an heir. Without one, the Catholic restoration would die with her. The match she chose shocked her people. Philip of Spain, heir to the most powerful Catholic dynasty in Europe. On paper, the marriage promised strength, money, and allies. To her subjects, it looked like surrender. England turned into a Spanish province under a foreign prince who could not even speak their language. Resistance flared quickly. In 1554, Sir Thomas Wyatt marched a rebellion toward London, proclaiming Elizabeth the Protestant alternative. Panic gripped the city, but Mary did not yield. From the Guildhall, she declared herself her father's daughter. England's rightful queen, and swore she would die with her people if necessary. The speech electrified Londoners. Gates were barred, rebels scattered, and Mary stood taller than ever. The rebellion's shadow fell on Elizabeth. Whether guilty or not, she was implicated and sent to the Tower of London, locked in the same chambers where Anne Boleyn had awaited her execution. For weeks her life balanced on rumour and suspicion. Mary hesitated to kill her sister, and Elizabeth lived on, but the bond between them cracked forever. Queens would never again fully trust one another. Mary pressed forward with her mission. Her government revived heresy laws, and those who refused Catholic obedience were burned at the stake. Nearly 300 people died, from bishops to artisans, their pyres turning Smithfield into a place of fear. To Mary, the fires were purification. To her subjects, they were terror. The queen who longed to save souls gained instead the name history would never let her escape: Bloody Mary. Yet her reign was not only fire. She reformed coinage, stabilized finances, and rebuilt the navy, the same fleet that would later defend Elizabeth against Spain. She encouraged exploration and tried to restore the kingdom's prosperity, but none of this endured in memory. The screams at the stake drowned out every reform. Her marriage, meant to secure Catholic succession, only deepened her despair. Philip found her devotion oppressive and spent much of his time abroad. In 1555, Mary announced a pregnancy, and the kingdom erupted in celebration. Bells rang, bonfires lit, and the future seemed secured. But no child came. It was a phantom swelling, a cruel illusion that left her disgraced and empty. The false pregnancy shattered her spirit. When Philip returned to Spain, England whispered that its queen had been abandoned. The disappointment eroded her popularity, and her health declined. Illness gnawed at her body, and by 1558, she was dying. She left no heir, no victory, only a nation divided and weary of fire. Mary's reign lasted 5 years, yet its legacy endured far longer. She had proved a queen could rule in her own right, stand before rebels, and command loyalty without a husband or son beside her. But her refusal to bend, her absolute conviction, and her uncompromising faith consumed her reputation. She had dreamed of saving England's soul, and instead, she burned her name into infamy. When Mary died in 1558, England exhaled. The crown passed not to a foreign prince or a council's puppet, but to Elizabeth, the daughter once branded a bastard. At 25, she inherited a throne scarred by fire, debt, and division. The transition was almost shockingly smooth. No uprisings, no invasions, only courtiers pivoting toward the new sun rising over England. Elizabeth inherited wreckage. The treasury was drained, alliances brittle, and the religious settlement fractured beyond recognition. Where Mary had pursued salvation through fire, Elizabeth chose survival through balance. She restored Protestantism, but allowed enough ceremony to soothe uneasy consciences. It was not purity, but pragmatism, and it gave her reign the stability England desperately needed. That pragmatism extended to her own image. Elizabeth understood that her greatest weakness was her sex. Kings ruled with swords and airs. She ruled with theatre. She presented herself not as a woman vulnerable to faction, but as Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, a monarch married only to her people. Her body became a stage, her unmarried state a symbol of national independence. Marriage proposals flooded her court, from Spain, from France, from ambitious nobles at home. She entertained them, dangled them, and then refused them all. Each suitor was not a potential husband, but a bargaining chip, a tool to be used in negotiation. By never marrying, Elizabeth preserved both her independence and the illusion that England itself was her only true spouse. This caution was not cowardice. It was strategy learned from bitter example. She had watched Mary's foreign marriage turn subjects against their queen, and phantom pregnancies reduce her to mockery. Elizabeth would not repeat those mistakes. Instead, she wielded ambiguity like a weapon, keeping rivals guessing and allies hopeful, but never surrendering her autonomy. Her enemies circled constantly. Catholic Europe saw her as a heretic usurper, and plots against her life sprouted in taverns, embassies, and noble households. At home, recusants whispered loyalty to Rome, while foreign powers dreamed of replacing her with Mary, Queen of Scots. Elizabeth responded not just with spies and soldiers, but with spectacle. She turned monarchy into performance, dazzling her subjects with progresses, speeches, and pageantry that fused politics with theatre. The high point of this theatre came in 1588, when the Spanish Armada sailed to crush her reign. Elizabeth rode to Tilbury in armour, mounted on a white horse, and told her troops she had the heart and stomach of a king. In that moment, gender dissolved into legend. She was no longer Henry's daughter or Anne Boleyn's bastard. She was England itself, defiant against the greatest empire in Europe. The Armada's defeat sealed her myth, but her reign was not without shadows. Endless wars in Ireland bled men and money. Factions at court feuded for influence, while economic strain bit at her people. She agonized over the fate of Mary, Queen of Scots, holding her cousin captive for decades before finally ordering her execution. Elizabeth's rule was never secure. It was a constant performance of security. Yet she grasped a truth that her father and sister never did. Image could outlast failure. Where Henry had decayed into paranoia and Mary into fire, Elizabeth sculpted herself into an icon. Her reign became less about policy than about presence, less about heirs than about legend. She was the Virgin Queen, eternal in memory even if fragile in reality. For 45 years she held the throne, transforming a fractured kingdom into a cultural powerhouse. When she died in 1603, childless, the Tudor line ended, but the idea she created, that monarchy could wear a woman's face, that power could be theatre as much as bloodline, lived on. Gloriana outlasted Elizabeth, a myth etched into England's imagination forever. Mary and Elizabeth were never meant to rule side by side, but each lived in the other's shadow. Mary, older, and already scarred by years of public disgrace, claimed the throne first, determined to restore the faith of her mother and her people. Elizabeth, younger and pragmatic, stood just behind her shoulder, potential heir, potential usurper, a constant presence in the background of Mary's rule. Outwardly, Mary tried to project unity. She rode into London with Elizabeth beside her, two Tudor sisters presenting themselves as partners in stability after the chaos of Lady Jane Grey. The image was powerful, Henry's daughters, reconciled by triumph, but behind the ceremony, suspicion festered. Mary knew her sister was Protestant, educated by reformist tutors, and admired by nobles who chafed at Catholic revival. Foreign ambassadors fed the tension. Reports to Madrid and Rome described Elizabeth as clever, cautious, and quietly gathering sympathy. To Catholic observers, she was a dangerous seed of heresy. To Protestant exiles abroad, she was a beacon of hope. Whether she plotted or not, her very existence was enough to make Mary uneasy. Wyatt's rebellion in 1554 proved how volatile the situation had become. Rebels shouted Elizabeth's name as their Protestant alternative, even if she had played no active role. Mary crushed the uprising with courage, standing before her people at the Guildhall and declaring she would fight to the death. But Elizabeth was dragged to the Tower, her life hanging by a thread, while her sister decided whether she was a conspirator or simply a symbol too dangerous to ignore. Elizabeth's survival was not innocence but calculation. In the Tower, she pleaded loyalty, denied every charge, and played the part of the dutiful sister. Her restraint saved her life. For Mary, sparing Elizabeth was both mercy and necessity. To kill her sister without proof would have stained her reign further. To release her meant living with a rival waiting in the wings. As Mary's marriage to Philip soured and her phantom pregnancy collapsed into humiliation, Elizabeth's profile only grew. Ambassadors noted that courtiers whispered about her as the likely successor. Her wit, her poise, and her Protestant leanings made her the face of an alternative future. Mary's failures became Elizabeth's reputation, every disappointment sharpening the younger sister's allure. The contrast between them became legend in real time. Mary was rigid, uncompromising, and consumed by her mission to restore Rome. Elizabeth was careful, flexible, and increasingly admired for her restraint. In the eyes of their contemporaries, one burned too hot, the other bided her time. Together, they embodied two competing visions of England's soul. Their rivalry never exploded into open war. It simmered in glances, silences, and heavy gestures at court. Mary extended public embraces but never full trust. Elizabeth offered flattery but never full loyalty. Their relationship was not sisterhood but chess, each move shaped by peril and suspicion. When Mary died, childless in 1558, Elizabeth did not need to seize the throne. It fell to her as if time itself had prepared the way. Mary's reign, marked by fire and creed, ended with a legacy of division. Elizabeth's reign began with the promise of balance and renewal. The sisters had not shared power, but they had defined each other's paths. In death, they were bound together. James I ordered them buried side by side in Westminster Abbey, their tomb proclaiming unity that life had denied. The irony was sharp. Mary had spent her reign trying to contain Elizabeth, and Elizabeth had built hers by undoing Mary's every choice. Together, they became inseparable in memory, two queens carved in stone, shadows of each other, each making the other unforgettable. Henry VIII had spent decades waging war against his own marriages in search of a son. Yet the Tudor dynasty endured not through Edward's brief reign, but through the daughters Henry had once branded illegitimate. Mary and Elizabeth, shaped by humiliation and hardship, became the queens who defined what monarchy could mean in England. Mary's reign was short and often remembered only for fire. Her attempt to restore Catholicism through burnings scarred her reputation, and her marriage to Philip of Spain made her subjects fear foreign domination. Yet her time on the throne was more than failure. She proved that a woman could rule in her own right, that the kingdom would kneel to a queen regnant, and that female sovereignty was not just possible but legal. It was Mary who forced Parliament to acknowledge that a queen held the same authority as a king. She signed laws in her own name, led armies against rebellion, and faced down plots with courage. Her policies may not have endured, but her precedent did. Without Mary, the very idea of Elizabeth's reign would have been unthinkable. Elizabeth inherited not only a crown but also the scaffolding her sister had built. Where Mary had demanded obedience through fire, Elizabeth chose survival through compromise. She shaped herself into an icon, transforming personal weakness into political strength. Bastardy, illegitimacy, and danger became part of her legend, recast as proof of her resilience. Her refusal to marry turned into theatre. She was the Virgin Queen, a monarch whose body belonged to no man but symbolically to her people. In a world where kings proved their legitimacy with heirs, Elizabeth proved hers with image, rhetoric, and longevity. She gave her subjects not a dynasty, but a myth, and in myth, her power endured. Together, the sisters shifted the European imagination. Before them, queens ruled only as consorts or regents, placeholders until men returned. After them, female monarchy was thinkable. Their reigns prepared the way for queens who would follow, from Victoria to Elizabeth II, women who could command armies, parliaments, and empires without apology. Their differences sharpened their legacies. Mary was remembered as rigid, uncompromising, and consumed by religion. Elizabeth as careful, flexible, and brilliant at performance. Each reputation was exaggerated against the other. Mary's failures made Elizabeth's successes brighter. Elizabeth's triumphs made Mary's struggles darker. Neither story stands alone. Even in death, they were inseparable. Buried together in Westminster Abbey, their tomb proclaims unity life never gave them. The stone monument calls them sisters, queens, and daughters of Henry, as if their rivalry had been harmony. In truth, their shared legacy lies not in unity but in contrast, the tension that defined an era. History gave them names that still echo, Bloody Mary and Gloriana. One became a cautionary tale, the other a golden legend. Yet both changed the monarchy forever, proving that power could be wielded by women not as placeholders but as sovereigns. Their reigns forced England to imagine a future their father never believed possible. The daughters Henry doubted carried the Tudor dynasty further than any son. Their reigns reshaped monarchy, faith, and identity, leaving a legacy larger than their failures or triumphs. They were not just sisters or rivals. They were the women who transformed kingship itself. Henry VIII imagined his dynasty secured by sons. He broke from Rome, executed wives, and bled his kingdom dry, chasing a male heir who would carry his crown. Edward came, ruled briefly, and died young. The great gamble ended not with the son Henry demanded, but with the daughters he had doubted. Mary was the first to claim that crown. Scarred by humiliation and armed with conviction, she proved that a woman could rule England in her own right. Her reign was brief, her policies divisive, but she forced the kingdom to kneel to female sovereignty. In doing so, she cracked the door open for those who followed. Elizabeth stepped through that door and turned it into legend. Where Mary burned, Elizabeth balanced. Where Mary demanded obedience, Elizabeth manufactured loyalty. She built her monarchy not on heirs or conquest, but on theatre and presence. She made herself an icon, and in doing so, gave her reign a permanence no parchment could guarantee. Together, the sisters carried the dynasty through storms their father never imagined. They ruled without husbands at their side, without sons to secure succession, and without precedent to lean on. Each endured suspicion, betrayal, and rebellion, yet both emerged as queens who reshaped England's understanding of power. Their reigns stabilized a dynasty Henry had destabilized with his obsessions. They transformed the Tudor name from a fractured inheritance into a legend of endurance. Through fire and spectacle, humiliation and triumph, they carried the monarchy forward when it should have collapsed. Henry's coffin burst with decay, his body reduced to grotesque myth. His name survives as a warning of tyranny and excess. Yet his daughters, whom he humiliated and discarded, secured the dynasty he risked destroying. History remembers them not as shadows of his reign, but as the women who defined its legacy. Mary's courage in crisis and Elizabeth's brilliance in survival created a lineage of possibility. Without them, there could be no queens who ruled in their own right, no golden age named for a woman, no monarchy reshaped by female hands. They proved that dynasties could rest on daughters as surely as on sons. Their tomb in Westminster Abbey proclaims unity, but their true legacy is contrast. Mary, the torch of faith; Elizabeth, the master of illusion. One branded bloody, the other crowned Gloriana. Their reigns were not harmonious, but together they altered the monarchy forever. The irony is merciless. A king who shattered his world to sire sons left his kingdom to the daughters he once cast aside. They took the scorn he heaped on them and turned it into sovereignty. They finished what he could not, making the Tudor dynasty immortal. Henry VIII believed power belonged only to men. Mary and Elizabeth proved him wrong. That is the daughter's revenge. A dynasty carried into eternity not by the boy who died, but by the women who lived.